And good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where people are logging in from. So grateful to have been invited to be part of this dialogue. And so before I get started on what the paper itself is about, I want to start off with the motivation for the project, how I enter this particular work and how I enter this space. So back in 2020, I was still a Ph.D. student in the Department of Government at Harvard University. And at the time, I was studying gendered variations in political behavior in Nigeria, trying to understand the extent to which economic empowerment for women may or may not be translated into political empowerment. And as I was trying to study this broader question, I was thinking about different types of political activity that different groups of people engage in, and not just running for office or voting, but thinking about protest behavior, supporting other campaigns, signing petitions, and other ways of engaging in the political space. And so as I was thinking about these questions, of course, in 2020, most of the world was under lockdown. There was a lot that was going on with the pandemic. And of course, we were all affected in different ways. But during this time, there was sort of like an uprise in the Black Lives Matter movement that was going on. So the movement had already started years prior, but this particular period, it was gaining even more traction given the recent deaths that had happened at the hands of police in the US. And so at this particular moment, just attending different Black Lives Matters protests in the Boston area and sort of seeing what was happening in Nigeria at the same time, I started having certain questions regarding what are the overlaps between these two different movements, what is going on, where are they similar and where are they also different? And so as I was thinking about these two different movements, one that was happening in the US while I was in the US, and also what's going on in Nigeria, my country of heritage, I was trying to understand what is the role of women in these particular movements, given their visibility in supporting and sustaining these two different movements, and trying to understand what are the different barriers that different communities face when they're trying to express themselves politically. So this is kind of where this project comes from. And so I decided to put my thoughts down on paper, and it was part of a special issue for Black Lives Matter for the perspectives on politics. And in this particular special issue is trying to understand not just the effect of BLM in the US, but trying to understand its global implications, how there are continuities and discontinuities with other movements happening across the world. So that's kind of the motivation for this project. And so for those who may not have had the opportunity to read the paper yet, I will be giving like an overview and a few details from the paper just to help to give a foundation for everyone so we can have a robust discussion afterwards. And so there are a few key questions that I answer in the paper, one of them being, what is the relationship between BLM and other anti-police brutality movements abroad, such as the EndSARS movement? What are these continuities and these discontinuities? The second question, how have Black feminist theories of intersectionality and personal politics informed these different movements transnationally? And as I'm trying to answer these two different questions, I'm also trying to understand a broader question of what is the role of social power in political behavior. And in this project, and even in my larger project that looks at gendered variations in political behavior, I define social power as sort of embeddedness in politically active communities, trying to understand the extent to which social networks could engender political empowerment. So these could be networks of family, friends, colleagues, peers, mentors, sponsors, different people in people's lives that could actually induce political participation. So that's how I'm defining social power in this paper, but also in the broader research agenda that I'm pursuing. And if there's any noise that's interrupting the flow of this, please let me know. I'm currently calling in from Nigeria. It's 9 a.m. There's a whole situation with the Wi-Fi and everything. So if anything pauses, please let me know. And so there are two core objectives in this paper. And the first one is that I demonstrate how Black feminist theoretical insights on justice in terms of liberation, intersectionality, and non-domination inform the BLM movements, and in turn has implications for other movements globally, including the EndSARS movement. So trying to understand the ways in which different Black feminist theoretical insights are not just informing BLM, but other movements that have a similar tone to it. And then within this particular paper, I'm also advancing a theory of protest behavior or political behavior more broadly through this lens of social power, trying to understand the extent to which people's embeddedness in politically active and politically aware communities is actually shaping how they engage in different movements, and particularly trying to understand women's social power in terms of how that translates into them spearheading and sustaining these different movements. And so just to give a little bit of background, starting with the EndSARS movement. So SARS stands for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, is a particular special unit of the police in Nigeria, and it was originally created in the mid-1990s to combat armed robbery and other crimes. Now, over time, SARS has been known to be a very notorious unit of the police in terms of being implicated in different human rights abuses. And these abuses range between extrajudicial killings, unlawful detentions, kidnapping, extortion, and other crimes that they've been accused of as well. And so over time, even though SARS was initially created to combat armed robbery and other crimes, people have come to understand SARS as sort of an enemy of the people, and specifically against youth. And so the photo that I have here in this particular slide, where it says #iPhone, laptops, styled hair, and living fresh isn't a crime, just to help explain what that means for those who are not as familiar with the Nigerian context. What it's speaking to here is that those who are usually the targets of SARS, or just the police in general when it comes to police abuse, are usually people who have sort of a particular presentation in terms of having what is considered a flamboyant lifestyle or an ostentatious display of wealth. So usually if a person has, say, like expensive jewelry or certain tech devices or certain ways that they present themselves as being kind of alternative or artistic, usually there's a suspicion that that person is engaged in fraud, which has been a huge issue in Nigeria for the past few decades. And because this particular unit has been trying to combat not just armed robbery and cyber crimes, but other forms of crimes that have to do with fraud, usually those that they tend to target are those that they profile as being fraudulent in different ways. And so typically those who are seen as being targeted as fraudsters are typically those who are young presenting and are seen as being those who got their wealth through ill means. And so that's the reason why this particular picture of this poster this woman has up kind of captures the people who are being targeted by SARS in Nigeria. And so within this particular movement, there was a particular group called the Feminist Coalition, which actually helped to raise funds for the movement against police brutality. So there are a lot of different people who were engaged in the movement in 2020. Of course, the movement has started before then, but in October 2020, given the toll gate massacre that had happened in Nigeria, where the police basically had killed a number of people at Lekki toll gates who were protesting, there was sort of like an uproar against SARS, and the movement gained a lot more traction, a lot more momentum during this particular period. And so the Feminist Coalition is not specifically targeted at trying to end SARS in particular. It was formed around trying to advance women's equality in Nigeria, both socially and economically. And so within this particular EndSARS period, they found a way to actually support the movement in order to provide finances for those who needed to be bailed out of prison, those who were protesters. So they were very instrumental in sort of raising funds to support the movement. And so when it comes to the Black Lives Matter movement in the USA, I would assume that most people are already fairly familiar with the origins of the Black Lives Matter movement. But just to give you a sense of how Black feminist ideas of Black liberation are part and parcel of the movement, I have this quote from a political theorist called Diva Woodley. She is at the New School, and she talks about how there's a particular political philosophy that comes out of Black feminism that's actually informing the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's really confronting personal politics in terms of confronting the lived experiences of those at the margins of society. And so I'll just read out the quote for those who are not very good at reading while also the speaker is also talking, so that I can really sink in how Black feminism is also part and parcel of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. So she says, Black women's situation at the juncture of interlocked oppressions has given rise to a political philosophy that understands justice as a state that can arise only from confronting the lived experience, as opposed to the abstract conditions of those at the margins of political, social, and economic rights, concern, and privilege. And so the idea here is that a lot of this understanding about people's understanding of self within the political sphere comes out of their own lived experience and how they've actually encountered the states in different ways. And a lot of this time when it comes to political consciousness raising is really coming from understanding themselves as being sort of enemies of the states, given their experience with police brutality. And so here, what I'm arguing is that organizers leverage their social power in the form of being embedded in these politically aware and politically active communities in order to effectively organize protest and demand for justice in the way that they deemed fit. And so what I'm saying here is that in these particular communities, social power is being harnessed for political dissent in the form of protests, in a community where political awareness is developed from experiential marginalization from the state. So if one is gaining their political consciousness in a particular community that has been marginalized over time, usually the form of political engagement that we were expecting to see would be political protest, in the sense of not serving the states, but really keeping the state accountable to what they claim to be. So if one is growing up in a particular nation state where they're in a community that has been ravaged by poverty, by crime, by unemployment, by other societal ills, and their experience with the police has been one where they've been policed, essentially, as opposed to being kept safe and secure, their ideas about the state and their place within that nation state tends to shape their idea about what it means to be a political citizen. And very often, that particular form of political engagement could then translate into political protest, given that people are fighting for their rights within that particular nation state where they have been marginalized over time. And so people are then using those communities, those social networks, in order to build the support that they need to push for their rights. And so part of what I'm arguing here is that the personal and the political intertwine, particularly when it comes to Black and African feminists theorizing about politics. One of the many different things that we've learned from Black and African feminists is this idea about how the political is very much personal and how the personal is also very much political. And so the idea is that they're actually theorizing about world phenomenon from lived experiences and considering how social identities intersect to affect such lived experiences in the world. And so even with this notion of intersectionality, trying to think about how being woman, how being Black, having certain levels of disability, or having sort of immigrant status, how these different identities are intersecting are also integral to understanding personal experiences as sites of political education and political action. And so one's identity is not separate from their political identity in terms of how they see themselves within a particular nation state. And so Black feminists, particularly in the United States, have popularized this notion of the personal being political, which is an insight that doesn't just apply to protest behavior, protest movements, or even the study of women of color around the world, but it's an insight that can be applied to diverse studies of social movements and dissent. And so there are a number of similarities that I had noticed with the two different movements. And even as I was doing research for this particular project, trying to understand what were the things that stood out about the two movements that were very much similar. And one of them was that even though the foundations of the BLM movement tackled anti-Black racism in the US, and then the EndSARS movement still adopted a lot of the language of BLM to further their cause for fighting police brutality and the demand for societal reform. And I'll show you a little bit of some of the rhetoric that was used by the activists who were part of the EndSARS movement in Nigeria. And you will see some of the overlap with some of the rhetoric that's used in not just Black Lives Matter, but even different Black power and civil rights movements we've seen in the US over time. And so another key similarity is that both movements are female-led. They have a decentralized structure, and they have both advanced feminist lenses for understanding police brutality and social injustice. And so the third key similarity, which is sort of like the basis of the theory that I'm pushing forward in the paper, is that the significance of social power in terms of the key organizers' embeddedness in activist networks and other professional circles help to facilitate this sort of decentralized leadership structure. And so just to give you a sense of how these different people who are key in these movements were embedded in politically active and politically aware communities, I have here a quote from one of the key members of the Feminist Coalition. She's one of the co-founders of the Feminist Coalition and was very instrumental in helping to really raise funds that help the movement gain momentum and more international awareness. And so I have here like highlighted some keywords that kind of show what kinds of spaces this particular activist was part of already that helped to garner her own political awareness and her own political expression. But not only that, but this notion of articulating Blackness within a context that's actually already a Black nation. So this is from one of the creators of Feminist Coalition in Nigeria. And Nigeria is a Black nation, and it's not a multiracial nation in the way that the US is, but you still see a particular articulation of Blackness and even Black Lives Matter being used within this particular space. And so she's talking about the difference between money and power, speaking to socioeconomic class and how certain groups of people have been sort of marginalized in the political sphere, and not just in terms of the representation of women, but even those who are lower socioeconomic classes, and then thinking about how can we then form politically active groups and thinking about the people who can be part of these groups and what kinds of backgrounds they come with. And so she was speaking to how she approached different people to form the feminist coalition and how each of them had different backgrounds in tech and media, gender advocacy, public health, and fintech. And what they all had in common was this notion of identifying as feminists and wanting to see the advancement of the Black woman. And so even this articulation of being a Black woman in a country where, again, this is a Black nation, is not a multiracial nation in the way that the US is, that has this sort of like legacy of racism where race is salient. It's very different in that this is a Nigerian context, but the people who are still part of this movement are articulating themselves in a very racial lens as well. So I'll just give a moment for those who want to just like read the quotes and then I'll move on. And so just to give you a little bit more of a sense of how a lot of this, again, rhetoric and the language of Black liberation that we see in the Black Lives Matter movements and we've seen in Black Power movements and civil rights movements in the US are still being used, even in the EndSARS movement in Nigeria. I have a few other quotes from other people who were also very active in the EndSARS movement. And they were speaking to how there is sort of like a strategic angle to using the language of Black Lives Matter to bring greater global awareness to what was happening in Nigeria. And so even this whole notion of identifying as feminist women and this group being called the Feminist Coalition, for instance, is quite radical, given that in the Nigerian context, identifying as feminist is still considered to be quite a dirty word. There's a lot of pushback against feminism in different ways. So this particular group that's trying to advance equality, gender equality in the Nigerian space, the fact that they decided to call themselves feminists to begin with is seen as a huge push to begin with. And so even this whole language of there's an understanding that no one is free until we are all free, this is very much reminiscent of what we see in Black Power movements in the US. And so again, these quotes are coming out of the EndSARS movement, but we see a lot of them happening in the Black Lives Matter movement as well. And so as I've been arguing when it comes to social power, many of the organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement had professional backgrounds in community organizing and the nonprofit sector. And so they sort of used or leveraged these networks in order to sort of like push for political organizing. So they leverage their networks and the advocacy and sort of like nonprofit space in order to build their social power. And so here is just one of the quotes from one of the co-founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. And so she writes about how she actually knew some of the other co-founders, and it's really coming out of these very personal kind of networks, these personal social networks. And some of them are inherently political. In this case, she had met the other co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement at a political gathering, but some of it is not actually inherently political in the sense of just reaching out to a friend who they know is already embedded in a particular advocacy space. And so the idea here is to really understand how are different people in different communities really engendering their own social power and using that power to push for political empowerment and change, not just within their own community, but really across the world, given the implications of what we've seen with the Black Lives Matter movement globally. And so even as I think about theorizing about social power and how that's engendered, not just within local communities, but even globally with the rise of social media, I'm not just thinking about it across space, but also across time. And so in the paper, I'm also writing about how for a number of those who were involved in the Black Lives Matter movement, the activists who are very much part of this network, they were talking about how they were building on generations of activists who have very much influenced their own approach to how they were going to enter this particular movement, enter this particular time. So a lot of these feminist ideas of non-domination and intersectionality and inclusivity really are not new ideas. They're really building upon this sort of rich legacy of the Black feminist tradition that really emerged and became more legible in the 1970s. And then these ideas are being passed on through not just personal relationships, but also through the written word, through books, poetry, and shared political spaces. And so the idea here, like I've mentioned before, is that the personal is political and the political is profoundly personal. And so these Black feminist ideologies are not just being passed on across time, across these different movements, but also across space, seeing how we see these ideas flowing between BLM and also EndSARS. And so these sort of ideas are coming through these different books that are written by the activists who are very much key to these movements. And so even though I've talked about a number of the similarities across the movements, of course, there are some key differences. There are more differences than this. These are the key ones that I focus in on the paper. And one of the key differences, which is really what motivated me to even pursue this project, was this key difference in the articulation of police funding based on variations in budget allocations and insecurity issues. Something that I found very, very interesting, which I think most people in this room might be aware of, is that within the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, a lot of the protesters have been calling for a defunding of the police. And if anything, to some extent, a lot of different activist circles have actually been pushing for prison abolition altogether. And so what I was seeing with the EndSARS movement, it was quite the opposite, where protesters were not pushing for a defunding of the police, but an increase in funding in order to reduce corruption. Because the idea here is that the police generally, even beyond the SARS unit itself, is underfunded, which actually pushes people to engage in corrupt behaviors and engage in extortion to begin with. And so a lot of the protesters are pushing this idea that if the police were better funded and better supported, maybe they would actually do the job of sort of like pushing for safety and security for the population. And so we can talk about this a little bit more in the Q&A in terms of the origins of the police units, in terms of not really being created to sort of serve the local population, but being created during the colonial period to serve sort of like the expatriates that lived in the country. But for now, I'll just leave it at that. And so the second key difference was that in terms of like the targeted group or the focus group. And so I've kind of alluded to this a little bit in the presentation in terms of how in the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the focus is on anti-racism, as police violence and poor public welfare and state failure is segregated around racial lines, given that race is very much salient in the American context. Whereas for EndSARS in Nigeria, the focus is on anti-ageism, given that youth are the ones who have been systematically marginalized in politics and are usually the targets of SARS and SARS atrocities in general, and just atrocities from the police in general. And so there's a different sort of like focus or targeted group and different articulations of sort of what are the implications of police funding. However, there are still a lot of like overlaps between the two different movements, but these are the two key differences that I discuss in the paper. And so part of the implication of a study of this sort is that it really expands our understanding of what political behavior could mean. It opens up possibilities for greater theoretical and empirical research on political behavior and not just protest behavior. And so really, even within this feminist tradition of bringing the personal and the private into the study of politics, Black and African feminists across different spaces have also highlighted other modes of political expression that go beyond sort of engagement with the nation states. And a lot of these modes of political expression might be considered as non-conventional when we think about conventional political science in terms of thinking about political activity as, again, running for office, voting, protesting, signing petitions, campaigning. But there are other forms of political engagement that might go beyond explicit interaction with the state that could be counted as political expression. And so some of these insights that are coming out of this feminist tradition of bringing the personal and the private into the study of politics includes other forms of relevant political behavior. And then some of them are coming out of the African context and also the sort of like Afro-diasporic context as well, thinking about how even though women have been sidelined in politics in certain communities, in certain societies, they're still able to express themselves politically by talking through male kin or hissing and elevating at meetings or evoking the supernatural in order to access power. And for those who are more familiar with sort of like African feminist literature or even African history, you might be familiar with the use of naked protests to push for rights in different communities and how women have come together to engage in naked protests to push for their rights, and the use of music and dance and campaigning as a way of expressing oneself politically. And of course, in the contemporary period too, the use of social media and other digital media forms to organize protests and affect government accountability, and the use of art, whether it's music and writing as forms of political activism, and leadership and civil society. So those are like other ways that are sort of like understudied in conventional political science in terms of how different communities could be engaging in the political sphere, but they're not really being captured as much. So if we're thinking about how certain marginalized communities might be expressing themselves politically, that political expression might not be an explicit interaction with the state, either through, again, voting, running for office, or even in terms of keeping the state accountable through protest. It might be through these other more, what might be considered subtle forms of political expression that are not so subtle, but are maybe just being under captured in the political science literature. And so what a study of this sort does is sort of open up our imagination of what could be possible in terms of thinking about what actually counts as political or not. And so I will end it there for now, just in the interest of time. But just to give like an additional resource, I have a research notes that talks about how we can theorize justice from the margins, but from the margins, thinking about Black feminist insights on political behavior. And this particular research notes would be, I guess, of more interest for those who are researchers and who are trying to think about really key ways that they can think critically about intersectionality as they engage in their own empirical and theoretical research. So thank you very much for your attention.